Greetings, everyone. This is Volts for December 12th, 2025. Advocating for decarbonization in 2026. I'm your host, David Roberts. Aliya Haq has been bouncing around climate world almost as long as I have, though she, unlike me, retains her youthful energy and vitality. After graduating Yale in the early 2000s, she went straight into organizing, advocating, and researching for the climate movement, working with Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, and then eventually NRDC, where she spent 6 years as the National Climate Policy Director. In 2019, she went to work for Bill Gates, leading policy work for his Breakthrough Energy project. As you may have heard, Gates has decided to shift funding away from climate toward global health. So earlier this year, a group of veterans from Breakthrough Energy, led by Haq, launched a new organization. It is called the Clean Economy Project, and it is meant to carry on Breakthrough's work, focused on building out the clean energy economy. In short, Haq has been around. She has seen the climate fight go through several political cycles and witnessed the rhetoric and policy evolve. So I thought it would be interesting to catch up with her about where her head is these days, where she thinks the climate movement stands, and what strategies she believes will be effective moving forward. We discuss blocking things versus building things, the woes of hyperpartisan politics, and the types of energy initiatives that her new project will be pushing. This is a fun one. Okay, then, with no further ado, Aliya Haq, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
It's great to be here.
Aliya, you and I have been at this for a while. I think we kind of started roughly around the same time. I was looking back at your LinkedIn. It looked like you sort of like were coming out of college, kind of launching into the environmental world in the early 2000s.
I did.
And this is roughly when I got involved too, when I started writing for Grist. So we've really had weird kind of parallel. I came in older than you, we should say.
I appreciate that you're recognizing my youthful.
Yeah, I know. You're on the youthful side of people who have been at this.
It's been a long time, but I'm,
somehow stayed young through the whole thing. Amazing. So you sort of came out of college into, I guess, what I would call the traditional environmental movement. You did your Greenpeace, etc., and then you did 6 years at NRDC, which is sort of the classic, iconic establishment environmental group. Then you went to Breakthrough. Now you're doing your own thing. So I just would like to hear some thoughts from you about how you're thinking about the challenge we face has changed as you've gone through that experience. Sort of how you're thinking about the road forward has changed as you've experienced the ups and downs and more ups and more downs and more ups and more downs that we've experienced in the last 20 years.
I'll be honest, I feel like it's been more downs than ups, but
it's like like 5 years of struggle up, and then like a month of down, killing it all over and over again.
Climate world is not for the faint of heart. You have to have some pretty thick skin, and you have to really be willing to go through a lot and try to see the light at the end of the tunnel. That's my main learning on this.
An irrational optimism is helpful.
Yeah. So I would say that my thinking has evolved many, many times working on this. And, I guess I started really caring about climate change during the Kyoto Protocol days, which is a very, very long time ago, it feels like.
Deep cut.
Yeah. To say my first rallying cry was 7% below 1990 levels really says a lot.
And that was our first spectacular failure, too. It just really set the tone.
Yeah, the Byrd-Hagel resolution coming out of the Senate of 95-0 was a real resounding sense of U.S. leadership back then. So, I have really approached the climate problem from all angles. I mean, even just starting as a kid, going into college, Anything that had the word environment or climate in it, I would study it. I did research in college. I did teaching of young kids in college. And coming out of school, the reason I entered the environmental movement was I saw this really important lever of policy as the fastest way to make changes. And we kind of had to redo the rules of how things were working in order to see climate successes. I still believe in that. And I stick with the policy change as what I think of as the core way to really solve this problem. But I have seen over the last couple of decades how the way we've approached it in the past is not fit for the moment today. The reason I say that is, I'm a student of the environmental movement. I will say that the road traveled between Greenpeace and the Natural Resources Defense Council is not well traveled. Those are typically very different types of people. If you're willing to climb a smokestack, you're usually not also the person who wants to write a report. But I've seen every strategy, I've seen every type of NGO in operation from the inside. And what I can say that links all of those sort of traditional legacy environmental groups, whether you are sort of the super far left activist or the more academic advocate type,
The white paper left.
the white paper center left, right, exactly, then you usually have come from a philosophy that comes out of the kind of old conservation movement, the old pollution movement. I wrote a piece in Heat Map that was talking about why we need something that I'm calling the third front of climate action, where the first front, I think of conservation in the early 1900s with Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, really trying to preserve nature, wildlife, forests. And it was all about extractive industries. How do you balance environmental damage with economic output? Like, how do you manage extractive industries like timber, mining, drilling? And then that evolved into, 1960s, 1970s, Rachel Carson days, fighting pollution for public health. How do we create safeguards? How do we make sure that air is clean, that water is clean, that we aren't dumping toxics in communities? And that led to like the whole wave of environmental statutes that we know and love today: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Superfund, et cetera, right? And thank God we had those movements. They were incredibly important.
I mean, we've been coasting on the Clean Air Act ever since.
Absolutely. And I mean, man, I got to say, like, I'm really glad that the Clean Air Act is there and has been doing a great job of keeping our air clean. Like, the smog of London and the turn of the Industrial Revolution and Beijing, it can be really bad. We need to protect that stuff very much. We can't take that stuff for granted, which I think many folks might take it for granted now. That said, I think of climate change as a much different problem than those previous environmental issues that we've tackled, and tackled with great success in the balancing of industry and harm, figuring out like where the right regulation is going to make sure the pollution isn't harming our public health. Climate's fundamentally different, right? So climate comes from every single activity that requires energy on our planet, and 80% of our primary energy is coming from fossil fuels right now because it's relatively cheap, relatively abundant, easy to move it around. There are a lot of reasons that our industrial revolution was built on the back of fossil fuels. That said, to really tackle climate, that means we can't get rid of energy. Slowing down energy production is pretty tough, but we've really approached climate change as slowing down or stopping emissions, similar to the Clean Air Act, or slowing down or stopping fossil fuels, which is similar to the conservation movement. Those are things that I have personally fought for many, many times over in the last 2 decades. And today I'm looking back at this and I'm thinking, I don't think we're doing it right. Like, I think we can fight for the same things, but think about it differently, where, it's less about this crisis in front of us, which I feel deeply, and I'm very motivated by stopping that crisis. But a lot of folks are not. And also there's this incredible economic opportunity ahead of us that didn't used to be there, right? So like, because solar and wind have come down these learning curves, because there's zero marginal cost, if we were better at deploying these things, we would be winning the climate fight much more quickly. If folks were feeling the sort of like shared prosperity of those industries coming up, we would be building more political power. And I think that the traditional environmental movement hasn't thought about it in that same way.
Let me stop you here and ask about this then, because this is the juncture here this one juncture that I'm very interested in. So I totally agree that like climate change sort of came to American culture via environmentalism, via traditional environmentalism. And everybody sort of bashes traditional environmentalists now, but like nobody else took it up. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
It's not like the rest of us were killing it. But anyway, so they took it up, and I think you're right that it got sort of slipstreamed into the conventional kind of like bad corporate actor, point source pollution.
Right.
The solution is to pass regulations requiring the reduction of that point source pollution. That's sort of the iconic environmental, the way environmentalism worked, and it got slipstreamed into that. And I think you're right that it's not fitting, but there's sort of two ways you could decide to move on from that. One is to just say that's not working politically, because politically speaking, people don't care that much about climate change. Most people don't. Like, politically speaking, people aren't going to want to hear about less or cutting back or whatever, or higher costs. Politically, we need to lean into optimism and forward looking. That's a political case. And then there's also sort of like the substantive case, meaning not only was that politically fruitless, but it was conceptually wrong. Do you know what I mean? Like substantively wrong. And I'm just sort of curious, like, is it one of the other of those, or is it both for you?
It's definitely both for me. So, let's take cap and trade or carbon taxes, which if you were to tell me that we were going to have a $50 a ton carbon tax tomorrow, I would celebrate in the streets. I would be thrilled to see that. That said, obviously, politically, that's not super useful. And also, that wouldn't solve all of our problems. Even a $100 a ton carbon tax wouldn't necessarily solve all of our problems. And one difficult thing is that there's obviously no silver bullet, right, to solving these issues. Using the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, I think, was a smart idea to try. I don't know that it's worked super well, and I don't feel confident that it will continue to work given the current.
Everyone, I mean, in defense of that strategy, everyone involved, I think, viewed it and said so publicly that it was the second best or third best solution at best. I mean, the whole point of threatening to do it was to try to bully Republicans into signing Waxman-Markey.
Right, exactly. It's like the big bad EPA is going to come after you if you don't do cap and trade, and then we tried to do that.
Very conventional Republican fashion. They said, screw you. And then when the EPA thing came up, they said, screw you. They just fought.
Yeah.
They just fought. They were not persuaded
to
make concessions by these sort of strategists, unlike, say, people on our side tend to be.
Yeah. Well, the thing I will note, though, I mean, when you dial the time machine all the way back to the 2008, 2009 Waxman-Markey era, so when I was, that was like 2006 or 2008, I spent a lot of time field organizing in communities, flying around the country. We had 24 organizers in purple districts. It wasn't a partisan issue yet. And our entire strategy back then was to get Republicans and Democrats in purple House districts to compete on who had the best climate plan. And going into the 2009, what was supposed to be a golden era of President Obama, Nancy Pelosi as the speaker, and Henry Waxman as the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, who had replaced John Dingell, who is just one of the most hilarious members of Congress that there ever was.
I remember all of that quite well.
Yeah, but it was Democrats, John Dingell and Rick Boucher, who were not super helpful to us on moving cap and trade forward. It was really about the economics, right? It's like if you're representing a coal district in Virginia or an auto district in Michigan, then back in 2008, 2009, you were not super excited about a cap and trade program or a climate action plan.
No one cares about this anymore, but I'm nonetheless going to say it. There were enormous subsidies for coal companies and coal workers in Waxman-Markey. If they had passed that bill, the coal industry would be better off today than it is. The whole point of Waxman-Markey was to start from the middle out, to be reasonable, to appeal to businesses, that was the center out strategy.
And it was to buy off the coal state Democrats who they wouldn't otherwise have been able to get to vote for the bill, right? So the real key, though, is that I would say in that strategy, the pricing of carbon strategy, which I think is still a tool in the toolbox, I think for a long time, folks who have rabidly cared about climate change thought about carbon prices as the way to do it, like the silver bullet. If we just price carbon, then it'll all fall into place. I don't know that that's actually correct. I think it is a helpful accelerant. It would help realign better incentives to price the negative externalities. But, one of the things that was super interesting about moving into the breakthrough energy world and seeing how clean tech startups work and how these innovators try to get off the ground, it's not just the price incentives that are the problem. There's a lot of other regulatory barriers and there's a ton of stuff, right, that is like holding back new innovative things from being able to take over an incumbent technology.
I kind of feel like we've all learned that together. Although I will say, and then I will let my Waxman-Markey obsession go, and we can move on. But I will.
I love this stroll down memory lane. So I
will just say there were 3 big sections of Waxman-Markey. The carbon pricing was one section, and it was a relatively modest carbon price, and the other 2 sections were basically like industrial policy type stuff. Although the bill got discussed as a carbon pricing bill, that was only one part of it. And arguably, it would have been, if you'd had passed the bill, it would have been precisely that kind of low-level background accelerant that we want. The idea that it was just all carbon pricing, that was a distortion at the time, and I think it's a distortion ever since. Like, it was much more diverse strategy than it gets credit for.
Yeah, that's fair. At the time, when Waxman-Markey was happening, I actually worked at Greenpeace, which opposed the bill because it had carbon capture and storage in it, not because...
Perfect.
Yeah, which is funny. Although during that time, we were quietly still trying to be helpful to it passing, even though Greenpeace had to publicly be opposed to it. So I wrote a report on Koch Industries and the funding of climate denial, trying to help create
Well, it really exposed the dysfunctions in the left and the environmental movement and in the left more broadly. I think the whole Democratic coalition, honestly, like nobody was on their own side. Everybody hated it. Like the centrists had their reasons for hating it. The left had their reasons for hating it. Environmentalists had their reasons for hating it. Republicans had their reasons for hating it. Nobody's on the side of sort of like boring mainstream. Anyway, so you say in your heat map piece, people think of climate change as a crisis to contain, when really it's a competition to win. And this is a very common move these days. I think it's very popular to say, instead of doom and gloom, let's think about all the possibilities for clean energy and economic dominance in the 21st century, et cetera, et cetera. I get it. And it makes sense to me, but I do worry a little bit because like even the way you phrase it, people think of it as a crisis when it's really something else. It is a crisis still, is it not? I mean, it is a competition to win. It is an opportunity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also still a crisis, isn't it? Like, do you get worried that this pivot, I know when you make this pivot in your heart, you still care a lot about climate change and it's still ultimately like that's what's motivating your work. But I worry that when this pivot gets popular, it becomes sort of a popular line. Do you worry about sort of like giving people who didn't really want to worry about climate change in the first place permission to just not worry about it? In other words, do you worry about this pivot is going to be too successful and people are going to be like, all right, well, I'm not going to worry about it anymore? Because that kind of seems like what's happening.
I think the way I think about these things is people don't have to have the same motivations if we can agree on the same course of action. So in like a mini version of this, oh gosh, I can't remember where this was. I want to say it was maybe like some Long Island watershed. I'm making up the geography, but there's a story from way back in the 80s where there were some nerdy scientists who really wanted to save this endangered salamander, and they're really worried about this particular watershed and how it was being developed. And so they went out trying to save the salamander. Nobody cared. And then they realized they talked about the clean water coming out of the watershed and how the development was affecting the water. Suddenly everybody cared about it. And then they were able to get the protections they wanted for that space, right? Is it a problem that they didn't care about the salamanders? They did it for the water? Probably doesn't matter. I personally really care about the climate crisis. But honestly, like in some ways, that is kind of a value judgment. A part of it's obviously a huge amount of misinformation, and a lot of it is just BS. And then some of it is that some people might literally just have a a higher or lower discount rate in how they think about
Mhm.
whether like their life is more important or their grandchild's life is more important, or if like, their life is more important or someone in Bangladesh is more important.
Yep.
And we can debate the philosophy of that all day long, but who's got the time for that, right? So why don't we just figure out why it turns out, like some of the work I did back in the day on climate communications, one of the things that I looked at was when people support the solution, then they're much more likely to agree with the problem.
Yes.
So if the solution is good for you, then suddenly you're much less likely to protest that the problem exists. That's where I'm at, where I see that we've made incredible strides in clean energy. The fact that wind and solar are incredibly cost competitive is something to celebrate. The fact that there's misinformation that they're kind of like expensive technologies for the elite is something we need to figure out how to unwind. The other thing that I'll note is in working with a lot of labor groups, I can see how the solar industry developed with basically poor labor standards
Yeah.
and like high turnover, low wage jobs where people did not see a career path where they could support their families has actually really held back the solar industry, that people don't feel like there's a shared prosperity to that. They feel like it's effectively another extractive industry. So I think of this as an economic piece where there's this opportunity not only to rebuild communities in order to move clean energy forward, but we also need to figure out, how do you make those communities stronger? How do you build wealth in these communities? How do you make sure that prosperity is shared? That's the really interesting stuff around this work that I don't think we've ever really brought together in a clear way. There are lots of groups that are thinking about community development, that are thinking about economic inequality, and the climate people are sort of on another side. We kind of are a different breed. And I'm really interested in how we bring those pieces together, where I am very, very fatigued by partisan politics and Democrats versus Republicans. And I'm seeing this realignment now where people who feel left behind, whether they voted for Donald Trump or Zohran Mamdani, you're seeing people feel like they don't feel secure in their future. They don't know if they'll be able to retire. They don't know if their kids are going to be better off than they are. Climate is a part of that picture, and we need to figure out how to make the solutions that we're putting forward congruent with the rest of that.
Yeah, I'm gonna argue with you about partisan politics later, but I'm gonna ask you, the abundance thing, whatever you call it, book, critique, movement, chatter. I'm sure you've been following that to some extent. To some extent, it seems obvious that on the forward-looking side of things, you are aligned with the abundance movement. You want to do permitting reform, make it easier to build stuff, build, etc., which I also am, with some reservations. But what about the critique side of it? I wonder, part of the abundance critique is that the green groups themselves, in part through this sort of historical habit, I guess you'd call it, of fighting things, stopping things, and the sort of lingering kind of degrowth vibe, if you will, around environmentalism.
The Paul Ehrlich model.
Yeah, that they are actually slowing down solutions, that they have not just become not helpful, but counterproductive. Do you share that critique of the green groups? And what's your take on, it's very easy from a distance to sort of lump the environmental movement as one thing and characterize it as whatever, degrowth hippies and Birkenstocks. But you and I know we've been around this our whole lives. It's very varied, a lot of different strands involved. I just wonder, what's your take on that critique and how accurate you think it is at the moment?
There is some truth to that critique, but it is not the caricature that has been put forward, if that makes sense. So, I was joking alongside many beloved friends and colleagues, I helped get the Inflation Reduction Act passed, one of like 1 million people who are part of that effort. And I joked, after shockingly we won that, after thinking it was dead for 2 full weeks, I joked that like all of our friends who got this historic piece of legislation passed will now turn around and fight every project that we try to get to move forward with it. And that was not totally incorrect. So, I mean, I did have a lot of kind of come to Jesus conversations with good friends saying, guys, we really need to build more transmission for us to be able to maximize these tax credits. We really need to be able to build these projects faster. And it's really hard for some of these groups to prioritize like transmission over stopping LNG exports, for example, which was a literal political deal that we were working through back in December. So that's the kind of thing where, they certainly are not, I don't think that they are accelerating the climate solutions that we need to accelerate quickly enough. I think there's a lot of soul searching happening, and I've seen a lot of good movement in those
Yeah.
groups going in different places. But, each one of those groups has hundreds and hundreds of people, all of whom have their own brains and think different things. And so the question is sort of how can they align and move forward when many of those folks got into that business with a really strong degrowth mindset and a really like they were not originally organized around this concept of building things quickly and saving up the climate crisis. They were born out of a different movement.
Yeah, and some part of me wonders, like, is there something perverse about trying to force them into this new mold? Like, why does that movement have to be this movement? We're getting back to your sort of new movement thing. Like, it's not obvious to me that these necessarily should be in the same basket. I mean, maybe people who want to preserve the salamander should have their
Go ahead and
they
do
should
that.
go out. They should have their movement.
Yeah.
Like it's bizarre that movement is also supposed to be the build thermal batteries movement. It's just not obvious.
The one ring to rule them all. Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. Where we actually do really need to fight for clean air and clean water and maintain these standards.
It's still a thing.
It's really important. Still a thing. And if we let those things erode, we'll suddenly feel really sorry about that. I think it is really important for those environmental groups to maintain the line on a lot of those pieces. I also think that, to the extent that some of those groups I think are more like Blockbuster Video and some of those groups are more like Netflix, where some might be able to adapt from their DVD mailing business into this new thing. Some of them are just not going to be able to make it. That's a question that is sort of up to their funders and up to their heads of strategy of how they meet this moment. But a lot of those groups were built in the 60s and 70s. The Sierra Club is much older than that. They come out of conservation. But, my alma mater, actually both Greenpeace and Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, both came out of the early 70s and were born out of this kind of more safeguarding of public health place. And that's great. And they came out of a place that had, 3 or 4 channels on television, 3 or 4 news anchors. Each city had a major flagship publication. The communications landscape was just so much more monotonous.
And I'll throw one other thing in there, which I think is huge, we're going to return to later. They came of age and were formed in this weird post-war era of sort of consensus in U.S. politics. We were much less, the parties were much more mixed back then, and there was much more concern across the aisle about these things back then. And so I think a lot of these groups born in the 70s and 80s sort of viewed their nonpartisan status, their C3 status, as sort of sacrosanct. This is not a political issue. And now, of course, that's changed radically. Polarization has changed everything radically. And this pretense that it's not a political issue, I think it's nonsense. But we're going to get back to that. But let me ask you, pivoting toward this new front, this new movement, which what do you even call it? I don't know what you call it, the build clean energy movement or whatever. I have some questions about that because I think there are reasons that the environmental movement evolved around stopping stuff when it became so much about stopping stuff. And it's not just entirely sort of the philosophy. It's also that stopping stuff is easy to communicate. It's easy to get people worked up around. It's easy to get attention for that kind of fight. That stop big bad corporation from despoiling things is a fight where everybody immediately knows the players, the dynamics. We all get that. And it's easy to sort of rally around the flag to do that. But when you turn toward supporting stuff, supporting building of stuff, I just think the political economy of it becomes much, much more complicated. There are trade-offs involved, different priorities, build more of this, and also you frequently mention TerraPower, talking about the sort of alleged nuclear renaissance. And I get that, but like, it's also the case that that is a private company doing things private companies do, which sometimes involve bad things, sometimes involve, I don't know, lying to regulators or dumping waste or whatever, like all the things corporations do. I would be nervous about a movement that just sort of becomes like, or becomes seen as just like the advertising wing of the private energy sector.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
that's
100%.
I worry about that. So it's just the dynamics of building a movement around building stuff seem complicated to me. Like build what stuff, where, and when. Those are substantial disagreements. So do you think really that this sort of third front can be a movement as we think of a movement? Is there enough unifying it to make it a movement? Do you know what I mean? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Do you think, really, that this sort of third front can be a movement as we think of a movement? Is there enough unifying it to make it a movement? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think this is such an excellent spot on question because it is super complicated. I think one of the reasons the stopping stuff strategy has had such a long shelf life is because it's easy to kind of prop up a villain, tell a storyline, easy to communicate. There's this very well-known trope of like the David and Goliath vibe to that.
And victory is clear. You win
Right.
if you stop the thing. When does the build movement win?
Right. So it is hard to kind of build around. However, I think that there's more opportunities for building political power around this in a way that is likely to be more effective. And it is true the private sector has to be part of that, right? So the part of how I see climate change resolving itself is when we've shaped the rules around markets to work in favor of decarbonization, we will have won, right? So like when clean energy is, and this only happens because of the policy environment creating it, when clean energy is the cheapest, most affordable, the most reliable, most accessible way to power your economy, your community, your house, people will just choose it, not because of climate, because it just economically makes more sense for them. That's how we will win on climate. Ultimately, we will not win because people are like, oh, geez, I got to pay more, but we got to do it for our grandkids. They're going to do it because like, oh, well, this is going to be way cheaper for me. I'm going to do it. That's when we've really hit, that is the real goal. And that's what the third front should be all about. I do think that that kind of approach opens up a set of partners that we have not been able to work with before in an honest way, because the solution set that we were looking at, think about all of the environment versus labor times that, like Keystone XL, every pipeline fight, every fossil fuel fight.
Again, I'll just say in defense of the traditional climate movement that it was only in sort of the mid to late 2010s that real solutions became viable.
Oh,
really.
absolutely.
You know what I mean? It's not like they had solutions on the table that they weren't pushing. Like stopping the bad stuff was kind of all there was available to
Yeah.
do back then.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I don't want to indict some of the really good organizing work that happened in the early 2000s and 2010s. I just think that we're at a completely different moment in terms of where the technology is at, what's cost competitive, what the polarized political landscape looks like, and how communications happens, that I see a lot of folks still trying to use the old political playbook, whether that's the old organizing playbook or just the old kind of like academic-y white paper playbook to affect change. And I don't see a lot of creativity or the ability to move within this incredibly chaotic political environment to affect really big change. I do think the Inflation Reduction Act was amazing that we got it through. And I also think that we did some pretty incredible work to keep some of those tax credits in place, given the hand we were dealt after the election.
Well, now, okay, this brings me to one of the things I kind of want to yell at you about.
Let's do it. Bring it.
Friendly yelling. So, and this is something I've wanted to ask a bunch of people. So you're going to be a stand-in. I've watched a couple of interviews with you pre-election.
Yeah.
And you were saying things like, this is good for the economy. People are going to see that it's good for the economy. Whoever wins is going to recognize the value of stability for the private sector. So they're not going to want to rock the boat on these things that just got passed. They're going to see that a lot of benefits are going to red districts, and that these are widely shared benefits. They're going to see that it was good policy and that it's good for a lot of them too. And so they will go after it with a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. This was what you were saying. This was what many people are saying. That turned out to be wildly, spectacularly wrong. They did not go after it with a scalpel. They went after it with a sledgehammer. I know that we're all required by law to put a happy face on and say, they didn't kill everything. There's a few little credits still scurrying around. But let's be real. They went after it with a sledgehammer. They crushed it. Almost all of it is dead, which means you were wrong about the Republican Party, what it is, how it behaves, how it thinks, what it's going to do. I was wrong. Lots of people were wrong about what the Republican Party would do. Instead, it got elected, and it has gone without nuance after all of this stuff, crushed everything, trying to crush wind and solar, trying to crush EVs, just blunderbussing in the opposite direction. So I just want to ask you, you were wrong about how the Republican Party would react to this. What have you learned from that experience, and how will that affect the way you operate going forward?
Yeah, I think, well, so one thing I'll say is I'm definitely not going to defend the activities of Republicans or Democrats. Generally, both sides are wildly disappointing to me.
Symmetrically? Are they both equally disappointing to you?
No, they're not equally disappointing, but they're disappointing in different ways. But the key thing on what happened with the Inflation Reduction Act and the tax credits is what I saw in the trenches of trying to keep the tax credits in place was that a lot of the Republicans who were seeing clear benefits in their districts wildly wanted to keep these credits in place. And it wasn't actually, they have their green news scam talking points and blah, blah, blah. But it was really a question about the debt and fiscal issues, not about whether we like wind and solar versus oil, right? Like the reason they gutted the tax credits is because they needed to find money to try to pretend that they were doing something about the debt when obviously they were cutting taxes for the wealthy and increasing the deficit.
Okay, so maybe you misused the word wildly then. They didn't wildly want to keep the credits. They mildly wanted to keep the credits, but not as much as they wanted to do a bunch of other stuff. They didn't care that much. I mean, that's kind of what we found out, didn't it?
That is true. In part, that's because I think that we were not far enough along in the benefits of those tax credits to be a strong enough political force. You asked what I learned from all that. My main takeaway from the last 4 years or 5 years is that everything just comes back to political power, and we don't have enough of it. That's my bottom line. On either side. The reason I find both parties disappointing is because the political power for this work is not nearly as strong as other things.
Yes, but I'm going to push you on being disappointed with both sides. The Democrats took power, and you, among many other people, spent years doing difficult good faith analysis and labor, putting together a very extensive, quite complicated, but really well written law that puts into action the stuff you're talking about, like this pivot from stopping stuff to building stuff. Like IRA reflects that. IRA was that in action. IRA was industrial policy, looking forward, stimulating new industries. And it was a good bill. And had it been allowed to run and had it been implemented, let's say better and faster, but implemented at all over the next 4 years, it would have produced just what you want. So, how can you be equally disappointed by that as you are in wild, false, fascist, fossil, backward motion? Like, I just don't see the parallel.
Yeah. Oh, no. I mean, like I said, my level of disappointments are very different and they're not equal in these senses. The main thing I'm saying is when Democrats are in power versus when Republicans are in power, I've rarely felt satisfied by either. And I have more emotions with one of those. But the reality is we got the Inflation Reduction Act passed, which was incredible. I mean, it was, the high water mark of, 20 plus years of working in climate change, right? And then I felt wildly disappointed that Democrats in Congress and folks who passed it didn't want to figure out how to get transmission cost allocation or other ways to build more transmission faster in place so that we could move the tax credits faster.
Okay, but it's Republican senators who killed that permitting reform deal. I mean, I know everybody's yelling at their environmental groups because they opposed it, but it was Republican senators who wouldn't sign on to it. They are the ones who are more immediately responsible for it dying, don't you think?
No, I would say that, to be fair, both sides are to blame. And I think that if Democrats had made it a priority, then it would have gotten through.
I'm skeptical about that. Part of what I'm trying to get at here is, do you, based on the events of the last 10 years or whatever, there's two different ways you could go. One way to go is both sides are disappointing in their own ways. What we need is bipartisanship. What we need is something that both sides support and can build from there. Another way you could go is Democrats keep trying to do good things. Republicans keep killing those good things. The way forward is to get Democrats more power so they can do the good things and make them stick, and to make sure that Republicans have less power so they can quit stopping good things. Do you understand? Like,
right.
Do you pivot toward bipartisanship or do you pivot toward crushing your enemies?
Yeah.
And it just seems like the Democratic Party is full of A students who are just like so eager to pivot and so eager to give up fighting. And it's frustrating to me. And I just wonder what you think about that.
Well, I mean, I'm a born fighter, so you're not going to find me in the spineless camp. But I would argue that there's like a third way. So I guess one of the things about bipartisanship that whenever I say the word bipartisanship, I just feel sad or tired is that it's just
Same.
It feels like what we're saying is like, well, these sides can't agree, so let's water it down until we get something we can move ahead, and water it down enough so that we get two people from the other side to sign on so we can move ahead. So I don't love that. And I think it is not a way for our democracy to run generally. And I don't think it's really a strong, durable way to solve climate or advance clean energy. What I do think we need to think about more, though, is there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who are not pleased about the direction that President Trump is taking them.
So I hear perhaps one of them would like to speak up and attach their name to that sentiment.
Indeed. But this all, again, goes back to the political power thing, right? Where it's really more about this kind of the elite establishment versus the kind of population that feels left behind. Like, that's what I see the new political alignment coming out as, not about Democrat versus Republican, but, Trump figured that out and he's been tapping into that. The reason why Republicans are shaking in their boots and unwilling to speak up against him is because they know he can sick the dogs on them and they will lose their seats. He has tapped into political power that they do not have. And they don't know what they're going to do when he leaves, right? So similarly with the Democrats, I think there is a kind of elite establishment class that understands how the rules work in Congress and how the rules work in the administration, but have no sense of a normal person who is not sure if they're going to be able to retire in the next 20 years, those are the folks who really matter in politics because, if you can gain their trust and you make them believe in you, then they will vote with you, right? That's where I think politics needs to be going. That's where I think climate change should be thinking about, where, to be fair, I think that most people who have cared about climate change are not thinking about it from that perspective. They are thinking about it from much more of the how do the rules work in Congress perspective. I think that is the new way that we need to be advancing clean energy and climate, because we're not tapping the political power that exists, and we're in a new place where solar, wind, and some of these clean energies will actually help revitalize communities. They can actually help bring life to places that feel left behind, and we aren't tapping into that in a real way. We try to message it, we try to talk about it in social media, but we're not actually doing that work where we figure out how to help communities get community benefit agreements or project labor agreements, or make sure that the tax base is getting a good deal so that the place is investing back into their communities. Like, that is really important work that I think is fundamental to how we move this stuff forward.
Clean energy populism of a sort, then,
Yeah.
sounds like what you're kind of describing.
Yeah, in a sense, I think the reason we are in what I would consider a dire political situation right now is because a lot of people have felt left behind by both parties. And I think that the kind of typical climate advocates have been focused much more on the elites than they have been on people who really need. I think clean industrial policy can actually help a lot of the people who are voting for folks that I generally don't agree with. If we can work with those folks and actually make their lives better today, not like their grandchildren's lives better, but if we can find solutions that both promote clean energy and also make their lives better now, there's probably some really important political legs to that we can run with.
I sure hope so. I will say I'm skeptical of this notion that they left behind economically, they're bereft economically, and so they turn to a party that every policy of which is hostile to their economic well-being, but nonetheless provides them with a lot of racism and xenophobia. The whole economic populism story, I don't know how neatly that fits, really. I think there's more culture involved. But we're running out of time, and there's two or three other major things I wanted to ask you about.
All right, let's do it.
So, clean energy populism, yes. Clean energy benefiting ordinary people at the ground level, yes. So then let's look at what your group is doing. So I should have brought this up earlier, but you are running this cool new group called the Clean Economy Project, which is an attempt, I think, on your part to seed or be part of this third way, this third movement, to be a pro-building, pro-prosperity, pro-energy, etc., pro-manufacturing, pro-group. Fine. So there are three big pushes coming out of this. And the first two are about the electricity sector, which I think is exactly right on. You and I think, know and agree that the electricity sector is the heart of everything. Mm-hmm. It's the heart of the future. It's the heart of clean energy. We badly need to bulk it up. And then the second one is scaling clean, firm power. Volt's listeners, I think, at this point know what clean, firm means. It's just these non-variable sources of clean energy. So hydro, nukes, natural gas with CCS, should such a thing come to exist, geothermal, etc. Clean, firm. The idea is you need clean, firm to balance the variable renewables, whatever. Okay, so you got modernizing the grid and boosting clean, firm, which is fine. But when I look at modernizing the grid, I see a lot of talk about big new power plants, different kinds of big new power plants, but basically big power plants and big transmission lines, big on transmission, and permitting reform and wholesale market structure. All that stuff is about the top-down grid, big power plants, big transmission lines. I looked and looked, and there's nothing in here about the consumer side, about demand reduction and demand shifting and demand management and behind-the-meter energy, distributed energy, VPPs, nothing about VPPs, nothing on the demand side. And when I think about clean energy populism, to me, that's where my mind goes, is bottom up, empowering local communities at the distribution level to generate and share and manage their own energy and to only turn to the transmission grid as backup. This is a very big power plant and transmission first view of the grid. And that to me reflects I see the ghost of Bill Gates in that. I see the ghost of breakthrough in that. That is the breakthrough and Bill Gates approach. And it bugs me. Is that deliberate? How do you think about that? Why is the demand side missing?
The 10 of us that started the Clean Economy Project, we've worked together for many years when we were at the Breakthrough Energy Policy team. So it's not surprising that you see what I would call the spirit of Bill Gates in our work.
Yeah, I guess he's not dead. I can't call it his ghost.
And, I think that there is a really important place for these major, I guess what you're calling top-down grid improvements to happen, because we're thinking at the scale of how do you move the entire global economy away from fossil fuels and onto clean energy. And there's absolutely a role for distributed power, demand side management, the consumer stuff. Personally, though, I think a lot of folks focus on that stuff for a good reason. And it's also just sort of more visible to people, which helps on the organizing side as well.
Yeah.
The reason I think we're much more focused away from that and more on how to move forward on major clean firm projects, how to create more transmission to get more like utility scale renewables, how do you change wholesale power markets so that we incentivize things. We're just hoping that those kinds of changes will yield really, really fast, really big results in like timeframes that we're hoping for. And, we generally take the both and approach with everything. Like there are very few climate solutions that someone can bring up to me and I'll say, that's a bad idea. Most of them I'm like, yeah, we should everyone should be doing everything. Like everyone's got to pick a thing that's theirs and they should run with it and move it forward. Our stuff is just more on the transmission and utility scale stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's the vibe I get, is that Bill Gates' spirit thinks of that as serious, big scale stuff, and the demand side stuff as kind of sprinkles that are nice to put on the poster, but not scalable, not big, not capital B big. And I just think that's wrong, frankly.
Yeah.
I just think that's wrong. I think it's the hope that the power system can keep working basically the way it's working, and you're just pulling fossil fuel stuff out and placing clean stuff in. But I think the system itself needs to update too, and I think that's going to be in the direction. And I think the distributed stuff, I understand why people view it as smaller or slower, but in practice, it's moving faster. Like the countries you're talking about, you, I think very rightly in interviews stress that there's a bunch of emerging economies that are about to follow China on the road to development, on the road to lifting millions of people out of poverty, which is great. We should all be cheering that. But those emerging economies, solar panels are flooding in there. Like Pakistan has imported like 40 to 50% of its national demand in solar panels in the last 2 or 3 years. None of that was top down. Nobody in the Pakistan government or any Pakistan CEO, like no big powerful person was responsible for that. That was all ground up, bottom up. And it's fast. It's moving quickly. I just think that the bottom up stuff is as fast and as big.
I suspect that the Pakistani consumers that were importing the cheap solar panels from China were doing it because it was the best economic choice for them.
Yes.
Which is that's what we're really trying to get to here, which is like we need to make clean energy the best choice so that every country, every company, every consumer can choose it as their preferred option, not because it's good for the climate, but actually because it's good for them right now.
Yes, I just think moving demand is as big a piece of that project as new kinds of supply and distribution.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean. I'm 100% in for a major systems-wide change and doing really big, different, radical things to do it differently. It drives me crazy that everyone's talking about electricity affordability right now, and yet I've not heard any solutions about how do you...
Oh my God, Aliya, we're running out of time. We got to talk about that too.
it just drives me nuts because I'm not seeing any real, and my team and I have been talking to all of the policy wonks and experts on, hey, there's this political moment that we could actually do something really big on this. And the ideas are not there because no one has ever thought of them as being viable.
Just this morning, I read a big new piece in the New York Times about this, about electricity affordability, about how it's central to politics. Dems think they can ride it to victory, etc. This race, that race. I read it, probably like 1,500 words. Nowhere did it mention or even gesture at what policies
Right.
Democrats are going to implement to lower the prices. Like that, somehow the entire story didn't involve that. And I have been asking Democrats of my acquaintance this question
Yes.
frequently. What do we mean when we say that? What are we going to do to make that happen? And
this goes back to my earlier comments about how I am disappointed by most people who end up in charge. But
you do this long enough, you're disappointed in everybody. I think that's the logical endpoint.
But you keep soldiering on because when you're a climate person, you have to learn to adapt to that. Yeah, I mean, the thing that drives me nuts about energy affordability as a political football is that there is an incredible opportunity for us to figure out how do you realign the incentives in the markets so that utilities aren't just charging ratepayers to make money, but they're actually figuring out how to deliver electrons in a more efficient way. I think demand side management's a big part of that.
Yeah.
You've talked before, and many think about how this grid has been built for like peak capacity, which means there's a lot of generation that just sits there. And if we could move that stuff around faster and easier, that would make a ton of sense. That's stuff that we absolutely want to see happen. And that's stuff that can happen at scale in a way that I think is super important. I get less excited, although someone should do this, and I just don't want it to be me. That someone should be going like door to door, getting people to replace their gas furnaces with heat pumps. Please do that. That is very important work. I'm not doing it, but it has to happen. Someone needs to do that. It's really tough. But I'm not going to fault anyone for doing the good work of being like in like neighborhoods trying to figure out how to we use those electrons in a better way. But like what my team is really built for is these larger pieces of like, how do you get the right transmission to unlock more renewables in the places that have the wind and the sun and get that electricity to the demand centers that need it? And how do we think about what are currently expensive technologies, but eventually do need to be cheaper if we're going to have a fully decarbonized grid? And we realize that's not going to happen tomorrow or overnight, but it does take some level of planning and policy and investment to go from where solar was in the 70s to where it is today. We can do that on a bunch of other technologies, but we have to be thoughtful about it.
Well, let me ask you about that. Your other big push. So the first one is modernizing the grid, which mostly focused on transmission
and market reform if we can.
And market reform. Say quickly, quickly tell me what kind of market reforms you guys are pushing.
Well, we're in a phase of figuring out how do you realign the incentives, right? So what drives me nuts is that utilities and the whole system is not aligned toward delivering electrons efficiently at a low cost.
It isn't.
So there has to be a way that we can rewrite some of these rules so that the companies are able to make money and also deliver electrons in a way that's best for consumers and is also good for the climate. There's a way to do that, especially now that wind and solar are so cheap and are not well integrated into the markets, and storage is not well integrated into the market incentives. There's a number of things I think we can do. It's again, not one silver bullet. There's going to be a portfolio of approaches, but we have to look at how that system is working to be able to use what we've already built more efficiently.
Yeah. And so that'll be grid enhancing technologies, all the stuff that we've covered here on Volts, making the transmission system better. So the third thing is supercharging innovation. And here we get back to an ancient, age-old fight in our world.
Mm-hmm.
The old innovation versus deployment fight. Circa whatever, 2012, I forget when that fight reached its apex. I would say that, more or less everybody has come down to the obvious answer to that, which is both. But I would say that among sort of leading voices, you all are leaning more on the innovation side of that. And so I just wonder about that because, I talked to Michael Liebrick lately, and his whole thing is like, we know 75% of the solution, 75 to 80%. Let's just get there. Let's just put all our efforts toward getting there as fast as possible. Like once we get there, we'll see how to do more, on the difficult stuff. But like concrete, which is like one of the sort of classic examples of like, here's a sector we don't know how to do yet. It's like 8% of emissions, which is from one perspective huge, but from another perspective, only 8%. Like if we only had 8% of emissions left, we'd be in a very good place. So why all the time and attention and political economy focus on innovation and not more on doing what we know how to do? Because as you well know, like just getting to the 75, 80% that we know how to do there's still a lot of challenges. It's like, that's not happening. That's not just underway. We still need to push on that. Why the focus on innovation?
Yeah. So, I would say that most of the climate work happening is not innovation focused and is on that kind of, 85%. You can quibble with that statistic, but that 85%, right? So I think one of the reasons that solar and wind is so much at the forefront is because those are the charismatic megafauna of the climate movement. And that's good. I'm not saying we should stop doing that. One of the reasons we work on transmission is because we want to see the deployment of those mature technologies that are already cost competitive not get held up by regulatory barriers or poor planning processes and otherwise, right? Like we should unlock that and unleash those clean sources as much as possible. And anyone who's doing that is doing God's work. That is great to do. I still worry about that leftover percentage where you can only do so much with wind and solar unless you've got some long duration storage or some other type of clean firm power, whether that's geothermal or otherwise. We're pretty technology neutral. We're not, one of your earlier questions was on, private companies sometimes don't act in the public interest. I would argue they never do. And that's one of the reasons we need civil society engaged, is to make sure that private companies that are going to make money off of clean energy and should, like we win if they're making money on deploying clean energy. We also need to make sure that a lot of the social good that comes from that is being realized and isn't getting thrown out or erased from the formula, right? So that's one of the reasons I think we need, it's not just clean econ, we need a really robust ecosystem of NGOs and civil society groups that are working on how to do this in a way that is responsible. So I think the innovation piece, it still needs to move forward. It is very much a both and. There's also a level of imagination that I think is lost, where we could do a lot of this with wind and solar. But, like I've recently really gotten into fusion. Don't roll your eyes. But I'm
too late.
But what if it worked? You
gotta be faster.
But what if it worked? What if it worked?
I mean, if it works, then like in 30 to 50 years, we're going to be in a great place. But like,
we have a new era of world peace and prosperity will usher in, which would be great. So I would never advocate for innovation slowing down the deployment of stuff that's currently at cost, right? Like I do not think that they are a zero-sum game. But I do think that politically people have felt like innovation has traditionally been a Republican talking point for doing nothing. And we're trying to turn that on its head, where innovation is ambitious and it is something that can move forward in concert with deployment, and they should not be in competition. They should be moving ahead. And gee whiz, if we can get like some really, really cool technologies to work that are able to come down a learning curve super quickly, I would argue that we should really only focus on innovating on technologies that we have a good guess would come down a learning curve pretty quickly. I wouldn't say that we should be working on stuff that doesn't have a chance of that. But
well, nuclear power has not come down that learning curve, and yet you are supporting nuclear power.
Third gen light water reactors, I'm not going to put a lot of my energy behind. But if some of the fourth gen new reactors can work, then maybe it's great. Maybe it would be great.
Well, they're imaginary, and so is their cost curve so far.
So is wind and solar at one point, right? So it's like we got to take some risks on things. And I think if we're able to, there's plenty of ways to do this. And the more tools we put in the toolkit to decarbonize, the easier it'll be, depending on what obstacles are in front of us. So I'm pro the strongest, most diverse toolkit possible.
For sure. Okay, so this is kind of a political question. Like the things you're describing, the general direction of your group seems to me to be roughly where the climate movement was kind of headed in the run-up to IRA. And a lot of what you're saying seems to me was reflected in IRA.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, like almost everything you're saying. I mean, when I read your sort of orientation and outlook and recommendations, what I think is like, yeah, that was Ira.
Yep.
So a lot of people in our world, as I'm sure you're aware, are sort of trying to out clever themselves now and say, well, we tried industrial policy and it didn't work. So now we got to try something else. Like Democrats love to declare failure and run off and try something new. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is no, the basic approach that we had alighted upon that produced IRA is the right approach. The IRA approach is the right approach. Would you agree with that basically in broad terms?
In broad terms, yeah. November was a tough time for all of us, and I would say the outcomes weren't what we wanted to see.
Well, not this past one. Don't forget,
sorry,
we just had another November.
Right, that's a
it
good
went
point.
much better.
Yeah, right. But had a lot of folks believed that the House would be in Democratic control in 2025, and it was not. If it had been, I think we would have seen a lot of tax credits stay in place, and we would have seen a lot more benefits come about. And the reactionary way that many Democratic strategists and pollsters are just like throwing climate under the bus as though that's the reason everything went awry, I think is maybe a little short-sighted and a little knee-jerky. But I do think that there is a need for a longer-term way of thinking about how do we make people's lives better and how do we actually make clean energy at the center of that. That is a strategy that I think would actually help win, and honestly could win for the right and the left, given a lot of the communities that could benefit from clean energy are in super red, super right-leaning places. This is a thing that over time I think will move in that direction. So you referred to my earlier interviews where I talked about that. I don't know that I would concede that I am wrong. I just think that the time scale that we need to work with is longer than one election cycle.
Well, yeah. Well, let me ask you that. I mean, there's sort of two ways of looking at what's going on the right now. One way is it's gone insane, and the only solution to the current Republican Party is to burn it to the ground and start something new that isn't deranged and fascist. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that that something about this kind of fascist moment is a bubble, and beneath the bubble, there's still sane Republicans who would be willing to go forward with an agenda like the one you're describing. And we just gonna have to wait kind of for this weird reactionary backlash moment to burn itself out. And then the IRA strategy will sort of emerge from the ashes of that. Mm. Do you feel like commenting one way or the other?
In the last couple of years, I've been really inspired to go into history deeper than American history, which if you think about our country, we're basically like, we're sort of like a tween or like an early teenager of a country. And like, if you look at like the history of China
it does seem like the moment we're in right now is very much, God, Mom, God.
Yeah, our adolescent phase is a yes. Wild one. But if you look at like the arc of most countries that have been around for thousands of years, economic instability will lend itself to these kinds of more authoritarian, difficult regimes. And where democracy works the best is where there is more economic equality, where there are people who are feeling secure in their futures. One of the things about the political landscape right now that I'm seeing be really difficult is there's this kind of like nostalgia for the grassroots civil rights movement or other, these kinds of, which, I get charmed by myself. That said, people have no time, they have no money. Like having a membership-based organization these days is almost impossible because like the whole economic landscape has shifted, right? So when you have these like ultra wealthy billionaires who have most of the money, that is where the funding comes from for the work that people do on this stuff. And that changes the dynamic of it quite a bit. A lot of these civil society movements at one point were membership based, funded by people giving $100 a year. That is a lot harder to do these days, and most of the philanthropy is coming from these larger sources.
Yes.
And the kind of economic inequality that is resulting means people have honestly less time and less interest in participating in movement-driven things. So we're in a different political landscape, and how we move things forward has to be adjusted to that reality. it is also the reason why I think our politics are so polarized and why we're seeing this less than democratic side of America coming about. So a lot of things I think go back to this economic equality issue.
Let's just finish with this then. You spent 6 years at Breakthrough, and now you're getting to kind of start fresh with a new group that you are running. So obviously there's a lot of continuity in kind of the thinking and the policy recommendations, but I'm just curious, like, what do you envision doing differently? Like, what did you learn at Breakthrough that's going to inform how you go forward with the clean economy thing?
Well, it is very different working for Bill Gates and not working for Bill Gates. So I will
good or bad, as much as you can tell us.
No comment. One of the biggest things that will be different about Clean Economy Project versus the Breakthrough policy work that we spearheaded over the last few years is we can be really creative about the way we engage and who we communicate with and who our partners are, which at Breakthrough, we were much more limited to a set of folks. And I think with Clean Economy Project, we can do crazier stuff. So, for example, we funded somebody who really wanted to tell the story about innovation in communities. So she flew out to Milford, Utah to interview the community members that are affected by like Fervo Energy starting their new advanced geothermal projects there, right? And that's something we couldn't have done with Breakthrough.
Cool video.
And we want to be able to tell some more of those kinds of stories. I'm really interested in us telling more stories around or communicating on how the electricity grid actually works in order to foment more outrage about the fact that it is basically an old 20th century machine that I keep telling my team, if Thomas Edison were resurrected from the dead, he would say like, oh my God, you can get packages delivered the same day. And like everyone's got these computers in their pocket. And then he would look at the electric grid and be like, this looks pretty familiar. I feel comfortable with this.
Indeed. I'm constantly talking about how it's so much more analog than I think people imagine. You know, people are surrounded by digital technology and they imagine the grid basically being like the internet, and it's so not.
And it's basically what we built in like 1930s. With a few upgrades here and there. Right. And I think that is in some ways because of the way the utility sector has worked, it hasn't had to innovate. It never did absorb the new things that it could do to deliver a better product at a lower cost to people. So how do we change that now? So I think it's a really interesting time for us to be able to do that kind of work where we're actually communicating more with the public on some of that stuff, and we're able to work with a larger set of partners.
It's good to hear you're going to get into some media and communications, as you know, a dire need. And I will just say that like the climate story is we, humanity, reached too high and we're being punished for our hubris and we need to shrink in response. Not a great political story, but we are struggling with this old crap that only benefits wealthy, powerful incumbents, and they are standing in the way of us getting cooler, better stuff. More prosperity,
exactly,
better air, like cooler gadgets, big bloated incumbents standing between you and a cooler, better world. That is a way better story, an easier story to tell, I think.
We would hire you on a Clean Econ and a beat if you wanted to join. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you for coming on. I could, as I said, we could talk for hours. I'm sure we will someday, but thanks for coming on, and good luck with your new group.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.